Okay, so let's carry on where we left off last time. So last time what we did is we started tackling our experiment by, first of all, breaking it down into a sort of laundry list of features that we consider might be required. What we thought we would need would be, for example, some way of grabbing some, requesting some participant data, for example, their name, their age, their gender. We then established that we also needed, to present some stimuli. We had to deal with actor images that would have to be displayed on the screen, so loaded and displayed on the screen. And for convenience, we would also need to display some text, because eventually in our experiment we might want to, for example, greet the participant, or, for example, instruct them at the end of each trial to respond and what key presses are available. When we tackled these problems, what we did essentially is we started, picking apart, some material that we found online, and we started, populating some scripts. We worked on a test input script in which we just isolated, the how to get participant prompt responses, and how to store them inside a variable that was called a structure variable, called subject in this case. So one variable which contains three different, let's say, elements: a name, a gender, and an age. We created another script in which we just tackled the displaying of text. So in this script, we covered the basics of actually displaying things with Psychtoolbox, which involved, for example, opening a window, closing that window at the end, drawing some stuff on the screen, flipping it in order to see it, and eventually waiting, inserting some wait instruction. We used a keyboard wait instruction, but we could have also waited for some time. So we're able to actually see that stimulus that has been drawn on the screen before we close the screen. Okay, we did the same thing for importing and drawing on the screen images of face stimuli. So we did that in the test display image script. So very, very similar logic to the test display text script. But it's in this instance, aside opening a window or closing the window, what we also did is we read files that were on our hard drive, we transformed them into textures, and we drew these textures, and finally flipped them in order to see them on the screen. Okay. So all these aspects, all these things that we wrote, I just want to point out that these scripts are already written in the folder. One is called input test, so it's this one over here, input test. Okay, and it basically contains the same thing as what we wrote down in test input. There's just some extra information, what we did. Sometimes the variables have slightly different names, but the logic, the underlying logic, is identical. There's another one that's called display test, which contains basically all the display related lines that we worked on separately in these scripts. So there's all the stuff related to text, okay, to presenting text, and there's the lines related to presenting an image. I also included this last one that I mentioned last time. It's not crucial, so I didn't want to dwell too much on it. But for example, one thing I did is also, in this case, I just displayed a blank screen by using this fill rectangle function that I mentioned. So I'm just drawing a big rectangle that occupies the whole screen, and it's a red rectangle. You can play around with this, just so you also get some familiarity with drawing some geometrical shapes, in this case a rectangle. All right, so what we're going to work on right now is flow of events. That's our third point. So what are we talking about here? Here's basically where we're talking about we're concerned with the timing aspects of our experiment. So in our experiment, what we said is going to happen is we're going to be presenting these two stimuli. Okay, so the face looking down, the face looking upwards. But these two stimuli are going to occur, on every trial, and they're going to occur in a very specific order, and according to a very specific schedule. So basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be showing a stimulus looking downward. It's going to appear at the beginning of the trial, and it's going to stay there for 500 milliseconds. At the end of these 500 milliseconds, we change the image, and we show this other one, which is looking upwards. And we do this for a longer amount of time. So in our experiment, it's going to be a variable amount of time. It could vary anywhere between 100 milliseconds and 10 seconds. so there's a variable duration here across trials, and at the end of this period of let's say of upward gaze, we have the actress looking back down again for 500 milliseconds. So all these events, we have to be able to control their order and their timing. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We also have to request a participant response because we want them to respond at the end of this interval. So once these events have occurred, here's where we want the response. We don't want them to respond here or here or here, okay? So the other thing that is related always to the temporal structure or experiment is the fact that this is what happens in one trial, but we're going to be collecting various trials. So these trials have to repeat, and we're going to repeat them in what's called a loop. All right, I'm going to show you what we can do. So let's go back here. Okay, so this is where we are. So yeah, flow of events, loops, loop trials, timing. So for example, when stimuli are presented, how long they remain on the screen, when is it that you're actually recording a response. So we're concerned with the timing aspects. Okay. Right, and the number, for example, of repetitions of our trials. When is it that we actually decide to exit the experiment? You know, like after 40 trials or something. Okay, so when it comes to presenting the stimuli, so in reality, we already have the ingredients to do this in the scripts that we wrote. Now we just have to sort of like rearrange them slightly. Think of them more specifically in the context of the experiment that we're trying to set up, because if we're presenting, we already know how to present the stimuli, and we also know how to keep them on the screen for a certain amount of time, because we have been using a function which is wait seconds. We actually use this more than once already, and we're just going to do that because basically what we can do is we're going to present a stimulus, and we're going to draw it on the screen and flip it on the screen, so it's going to be on the screen, and we're going to wait for a certain amount of time specified by wait seconds before we start drawing another stimulus. So basically that's all we're going to be doing. So when we start off by doing that, so let's come back here to our MATLAB space in our editor, okay, and let's open a new tab. Okay, and in this tab, okay, what are we going to do? So we could start writing from scratch, but if you think about it, all these things that we're talking about would basically be an extension of what we already worked on in test display image. So I'm going to go back to test display image, and I'm just going to copy everything. So I'm just going to Control A, Control C, and paste it in here. So I'm pasting it in here. I'm not going to modify this script by adding extra features to it, because I want this script to be just about displaying images. I don't want it to cover other logic, basically, you know, because I want to remember this whole approach that we're doing is that we're taking this big thing, which is the experiment, this big recipe, and we're breaking it down into all the small elements that compose it. Okay, and displaying images is just one element, and we don't want to get it confused with other aspects. So in here, it's more specifically about, it's going to be specifically about how these events flow, you know, in the context of a trial. So basically, essentially, what we're going to be building is just one trial, okay? So we could call it, for example, I'm going to call it test flow trial, just so we understand that essentially we're just building the blueprint of a trial. Okay, so a lot of the things we have here are we're already in a good place over here, right? Because we're opening our window, yeah, which is definitely something we need to do. We are loading our images that are bitmaps, BMP files. We are converting these images into textures, okay? And we're drawing them on the screen, but we're drawing them one texture at a time. So we're first drawing one texture, okay, which was the gaze looking downwards. We're flipping it so we're able to see it. And then we're waiting for keyboard press, okay? After that keyboard press, we wait for some time, but we wait for some time just so that once the second stimulus is drawn and it's waiting for another keyboard press, there's sufficient time between these two for me to actually release the keyboard press, or else this keyboard press here and this one here will basically overlap in time. So I wouldn't have a chance of really seeing the second stimulus. By adding this little pause, I make sure that I have enough time after having pressed the button here to actually release the button, because this is about 500 milliseconds. So plenty of time for me to actually, get my finger off the keyboard. Okay, so this seems, like a good start, but there's just some variations that we have to do to this. Basically, what we're going to need to do is, we're happy with this part here because we're drawing the face looking down, and that's exactly what we wanted to do. So let's just go back here. So we got this part here, right? We're displaying the stimulus looking down. We want to keep it on for 500 milliseconds. Okay? Now, so this part is fine because we're drawing it, we're flipping it, that's fine. There's also 500 milliseconds. This is 500 milliseconds over here, so that's fine. What we have to do is remove the keyboard press, because we don't want the participant to respond here. We want them to respond here. So the things that happen in here should be controlled purely by MATLAB, not by the participant. Okay? So the flow of these events should be controlled by a timer, not by a key press. Okay, so I'm just going to remove this keyboard weight from here for the moment. I'm just going to cut it because I'm going to place it in a few lines down. So let me just rename a little bit of these things just so we're a bit more consistent. So what we're drawing here is the gaze down. Alright, and I'm going to write here for 500 milliseconds, just so we remember what we're doing. So we're drawing it, we're flipping it, and we're waiting 500 milliseconds. Okay, so what happens then? After these 500 milliseconds, what we have to do is draw the other stimulus, which is this stimulus here. Okay, so draw texture 2. Let's actually say draw gaze up. I'm gonna do this for a variable amount of time. Okay, for a variable amount of time. Okay. So we're drawing the upward gaze stimulus, and that's absolutely fine. We're flipping it, so we're actually able to see it on the screen. And again, we're not going to actually be requesting for a key press, so I'm just going to scoot that down. We're going to be waiting for a certain amount of time. So here I'm going to say just wait. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy this, and I'm going to plug it in here. So I could wait, 500 milliseconds, but I want to sort of simulate what's going on in here. Now, if you see here, it's not a constant duration. On every trial, it would technically be a different duration. So I could plug in, because we're just simulating a trial, I could just plug in any number in here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have MATLAB choose a random number to plug in here. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to say wait for a random amount of time. So I'm going to use a function that's called randy, which stands for random integer. Okay, so I'm just going to create a variable that's going to be, we're going to call it, something like random time, and it's going to be equal to, and I'm going to be using a function that's called, as I said, randy, random integer. And all you have to do is, for example, just say what's the maximum integer that might be drawn, that you might be drawing from. So for example, if I write 3, it's basically going to be a random number, any random integer, so it has to be a full number, not with decimal places, between 1 and 3. Okay, if I would have plugged in 5, it would have been a random number between 1 and 5, so 1, 2, 3, or 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, yeah. So I'm going to plug 1 and 3, so basically every time I run this function, I'm going to get a number that could be 1, or 2, or 3. So actually, we can test this. I'm just going to copy this line here without the semicolon because I want to see the output in the command window. So I'm just copying this bit here without the semicolon. And I'm going to run it, and I get a 1. I want to run it again, so I press up to recall it. And you see that I got a different number. I'm going to press up again, a different number now, okay, and so forth. Okay. So I'm going to plug this number here, which is stored in this variable, random time, into wait seconds. So every time I run this script here, random time, there's a chance that it might be a different number, either 1 or 2 or 3. And we're going to end up waiting for that amount of time, 1 or 2 or 3 seconds. Okay, so that's fine. That seems to make sense. Okay, so the only thing we're missing now, so we sort of covered this bit here, so we now presented the upward gaze stimulus. For a variable amount of time, we sort of simulated between 1 and 3 seconds. So it's not exactly this range here, but it doesn't matter. It's just for the sake of, you know, having something vary. The last thing we're waiting for is a gaze downward stimulus, again, for 500 milliseconds. So essentially the same thing that happened here at the head happens at the tail. So because it's the same thing, I'm just going to copy this altogether. I'm not going to rewrite it. You know. So I'm just going to plug it here, like that. Okay, and what's the last thing? The last thing is that at the end of this trial, I'm going to be expecting for a response, okay, from the participant. So we already actually have that. We have a keyboard wait. So for the moment, it's something very crude. You know, it's just like just waiting for a keyboard press. Any keyboard press is going to be fine. When it's going to come down to the actual experiment, we're going to be more specific about it. We're going to request a very specific key. It might be just, for example, the A or the L key. All right. For the moment, it's because we're just dealing with the time flow of things. We're fine with just having keyboard wait. Okay. When it's going to, there's going to be, further down the line, there's going to be a specific, you know, we're going to specifically tackle response collection, so we're going to get more particular with this. Okay, so we have our keyboard wait here, and then we close the screen. So let's just review what's going to happen and what we expect to happen. So we're going to open the window, makes sense. We're going to load our stimuli, right, and we're storing them in MATLAB as, you know, 2 matrices. Then what we do is we convert these matrices, which represented, if you remember, just pixel values. We're going to transform them into textures, and we use the Psychtoolbox screen make texture function for that. Then we draw the first texture, which was the one looking down, and we flip it so we're able to see it on the screen. We wait 500 milliseconds, so this stimulus remains on the screen for this amount of time. Then we draw and flip the next stimulus, which is the one looking upwards. This time we randomly choose a number between 1 and 3 and wait for that amount of time. Okay. Following that, so once this amount of time is over, we present once again the face looking down, we flip it, and we wait for 500 milliseconds again. Here we request a response, which is, you know, in the experiment it's going to be some specific keyboard press. Here it could be any keyboard press. Once this happens, we're going to close the screen, and the experiment and our trial is over. So let's save this. Let's run this. Okay. Okay. So the stimulus looked down, up, down, and now it's stuck here because it's waiting for a response. Okay. So everything seems to be working absolutely fine. So what's the next thing we need? So we kind of covered, if you think about it, we basically have a fully functioning trial. It would be worth, well, this is going to be obvious in just 1 second. So now we have one trial, but we're going to be collecting various trials. And we said that there's one way in which basically what we can do is we can loop trials. So for example, we loop events in MATLAB, in which we're going to be presenting these stimuli and this order for these durations, and then after the response, we simply repeat this, and we repeat it, and we repeat it, and we repeat it for a number of times that we've predetermined. For example, we're going to decide that our maximum number of trials is going to be 20 or something like that. So the way we do that, we can do that, there's 2 basic ways, is with what's called a for loop or a while loop. They're 2 different, slightly different loops. So these things are all covered in MATLAB for psychologists. So once again, you know, that should be that should be square one for you. Okay, so a for loop. A for loop basically works like this. You have write for, and you create a variable. I can have any name. I'm going to call it counter, but it could be called I, B. It could be called anything. It doesn't really matter. The point is that this variable, what's going to happen is that it's going to vary. It's going to change on every iteration of a loop, and on every iteration, its value will increase by 1. Okay. So the way you create this is basically you set the name of the variable and you say is equal to, and then you basically say, you provide a range. So for example, you say counter is going to be a number that is going to go from 1 to, for example, 5. So you write from 1, colon 5, okay? Then what happens is that counter, this variable counter, is going to, its value is going to change every time this for loop iterates. So on the first iteration, counter will be equal to 1. On the second iteration, so the second time around, counter is going to be equal to 2. On the third time, counter is going to be equal to 3, and so forth. When counter is equal to 5, that's the last time, and it exits. So what you could do anything on every iteration. You could do anything. For the moment, just to show you what it's doing, just to show you the basic thing that it's iterating, I'm just going to have it do something very pointless, which is like simply, I'm just going to have it multiply counter by 10. That's all it's going to do. Okay. I'm not going to put semicolon because I want you to see the output on every iteration. So I'm just going to leave it without semicolon. I'm going to write end at the end. So that's basically where the loop starts and where it ends. So before I press enter, so let's just see what's going to happen. So in this loop, I have a counter variable, which I called counter. Its values will vary between 1 and 5 in steps of 1. And on every iteration, its value will increase by 1. So basically, on the first iteration, counter will be equal to 1. So what I'm doing to it is I'm going to be taking its value, 1, and multiplying it by 10. So I'm going to get 10. On the second iteration, so when this has been completed, it's going to repeat. And the value of counter is now going to be 2. And I'm going to be multiplying by 10. So I'm going to get 20, and so forth. So I'm going to press enter here, and you should get this. You should get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, because what I've done is I've just repeated for 5 times this multiplication. And the value of this variable here changed on every iteration. It became 1 bigger. So it was 1, first it was 1, then it was 2, then it was 3, then it was 4, then it was 5, yielding 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, because every time I'm multiplying it by 10. I'm going to be using this basically instead of having something as pointless as just multiplying the counter by some number, I'm actually going to have my stimuli presented here. Okay, so I'm just going to be repeating over and over the presentation of the stimuli. So this is rather simple. All I really need is to encapsulate the presentation of stimuli within a for loop. Okay, so the question here is, where do I put the for loop? Okay, so I'm obviously going to put it after I open my window. I could put it here. I could start it here. But it would be kind of pointless because the stimuli are being loaded here, and I don't want to load them 5 times if I had 5 trials, let's say. I just need to load them once, so it doesn't really make sense to start the for loop here because I don't want to iterate through this. It's always the same stimuli. It doesn't really make sense. If these were different stimuli in every trial, then it would make sense. But in this case, it's always F1 and F2, so it doesn't really make sense. The same for the texture. I mean, also the texture. There's no reason why I would want to iterate. I would want to iterate through various instances of making a texture. I've loaded the 2 images, and it's only 2 images. I created them. I created textures, made textures out of them. Fine. I just need to do that once. So basically, where I really want my for loop is right about here. Okay. So I want to start my loop just before I actually draw the stimuli, because this is essentially my trial, right? Because my trial starts with drawing the first stimulus and ends with a participant responding. So as a matter of fact, let's actually give this a name. I'm going to write this in caps so I just can visualize that this is like the bulk of, this is the important bit, and I'm going to call it trial. Now because we're looping trials, I'm going to write loop. Okay. So I'm going to write 4 over here. So remember, 4, I'm going to create a counter, and I'm going to give it a range of values. So I'm going to call the counter, I could call it anything, I could call it counter, but I'm going to call it trial, because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. So it's equal to, let's say, 1 through how many trials do we want? Let's just do 3 trials for the moment, because we could plug any number in here. Okay, so where does this, we have to also specify where this for loop ends. It will end, let's have it end, well, right here, because this is where we're getting our response. So let me actually just erase this and key press at end of trial. Okay, so I'm going to plug in my end statement here, like that. Okay, now just in order for me to be able to clearly visualize this, I'm going to take all the text that's inside the for loop, and I'm just going to indent it. I'm just going to move it forward. I can do that by pressing tab. So if I just press my tab button, everything's going to move forward. Okay, and therefore from a visual standpoint, it's going to be far, as you can see, it's far clearer to see how things are nested. So all this stuff, for example, is inside the try part of my try catch thingy, and all this stuff here is happening inside my for loop. It doesn't really change anything in terms of executing. So if everything were were like this, you would be absolutely fine. It would still run. It's just harder to understand what's going on, because all of a sudden you sort of lose track of, okay, where's my for loop? Because after all, I might have, for example, a for loop, and inside of it I might have another for loop. You could also have that, right? Potentially. In order to set things, however, there's a little trick. In order to indent them, you don't have to do it manually. You can have MATLAB do it for you. So the way you do it is you just select the part you want to indent. I'm just going to select everything. So Control A, because I'm using Windows. And then I'm just going to press Control I. Okay, and MATLAB automatically indented everything. All right, so let's try running this. So what we're assuming is going to happen is that we're going to open our window, we're going to load our stimuli, we're going to transform them into textures, then we're going to be inside a loop. And on the first part of the loop, what we're going to do is on every iteration of the loop, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be presenting a stimulus for 500 milliseconds, then presenting another one for a random amount of time, then presenting the first stimulus again for 500 milliseconds. Then we're going to be waiting for a response. Once I have emitted the response, the program just goes back to here. Okay, it goes back to here, and we repeat everything in the same identical way. Of course, the duration here on the second time around might be different, because this is a random number. So that's why we use this random thing, sort of to simulate our experiment, where across trials you might get a different duration of this stimulus over here. At the end of the third time, so the third time we carry this out, this loop does not repeat, it exits. So we keep on going from here until we reach here, and we exit, and we close the screen. So let's try running this. So I'm just going to run it. Okay. So we finished the first trial. I'm going to press space. Second trial. Third trial. Perfect. Okay, so notice that it's a little bit hard visually to understand when one trial finished and the other one started, because when we draw the last stimulus, we then drew again essentially the same stimulus, because the last stimulus that I draw is the same as the first stimulus I draw. So what we could do, just to make this a little bit more obvious that the trial is finished, is we're actually going to include here, we're going to blank the screen. Okay, so this might actually be a good instance to use if you remember in the display test script, which is the one that you already have that works out of the box, that's in the folder. There was a display a blank screen. This could be used over here, so we could actually use this. Actually, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy these two lines. But I'm going to be very careful because I can already see that the name of the window that I used, which is the one I opened up here, is spelled slightly different to how I did it in my test flow trial. So just bear that in mind, okay? Just be careful with these details because they're very important. They make all the difference. Okay, so when is it that we would present this blank screen? We could do it right. Let's do it after the keyboard press. Yeah. So I'm just going to copy these two. I'm going to indent them. So I'm going to do this automatically. So I'm just going to press Control I when I select them. I'm going to write over here blank screen. At end of trial. Okay, so basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be drawing a rectangle. So that makes sense. It's going to be filled with a specific color that we specified in this video over here. So we have to, as usual, when it comes to drawing, you know, we provide the name of the function, so what we're going to be drawing, the window in which we're going to be doing it. So notice that it's spelled differently. So this is the way we want it written. As a matter of fact, I know that this is not the right way because if I click on it, there are no examples of this in my text, in my script, and there should be an example because I opened a window called, in this case, my window, like that. Okay, so it has to be written in a specific way. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it here, and also here when it comes to flipping, because again, you know, I'm drawing the rectangle, but then I actually have to flip in order to see it. The other thing I have to do, I already know this because I've been through this, through the motion several times, is that this stimulus has to remain on the screen for a certain amount of time. You know, if I just flip it, and then I have some other draw and flip instruction happening, these two events will actually happen almost simultaneously. So I'm just going to add another wait seconds over here. So I'm just going to say wait at end of trial. So this is something that's typically called an inter-trial interval. So it's the time, it's the brief little pause between two trials. Okay. So how much do we want to wait for? Yeah, we could wait for, I don't know, 1 second, just so we have a little bit of breathing room. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to run this, but before let's just review what's going to happen. So I'm going to draw on every trial, I'm going to draw the first stimulus and flip it. So it's going to be on the screen for 500 milliseconds. I draw and flip the second stimulus, and it stays on the screen for a random amount of time. Then I draw and flip what is again the first stimulus, the same as the first stimulus, so looking downwards, for a fixed amount of time, for 500 milliseconds. Then I wait for a keyboard press, and after that I blank the screen, I draw a rectangle. Okay, so here we're drawing a red rectangle, it's absolutely fine. I know that this is red because this is where you specify the color, and you would know this if you look up the help file of this. So actually let me just do that. So okay, so I'm just going to write that, and I'm going to put my question mark over here. Screen, fill rectangle, okay. Window pointer, so on what window are you going to be doing it? On my window. Color, there it is, okay, color. So as you can see, color is the index. It's just basically, it could be just a number, a scalar, or a triplet of values, because remember that colors, colors are generally the composition of 3 primary colors, red, green, and blue. So red, full on red, no green, no blue. It's just red. Basically, this just means red. Okay. So we're going to draw this rectangle. We're going to flip it, so we're going to be able to see it on the screen, and it's going to remain there for 1 second. Actually, you know what? Because it might be a bit jarring just to see this big, red thing on the screen. Let's just make this gray. Okay, let's just make this gray. So instead of writing 25500, which would have been a red screen, you can try running it, by the way, like this, just so we see. But anyway, I'm going to put a gray color. So I'm just going to put one number, which is going to be 127. And that should just be middle gray. Okay, so between the number in between 0 and 255, more or less. Okay, so I'm just going to try running this and let's see what happens. Okay, it's waiting for a button press. Gray screen. Trial number 2. Perfect. And it exits. All right. So let's just go here. Let's see where we are. Okay, so what do? We talked about the flow of events. You know, so for example, the timing of stimuli. So when are they presented? How long do they last? When is it that we're actually recording a response? We talked about, you know, looping trials, because we are not going to just be collecting one trial. We're going to be recursively collecting trials, running trials. Okay, we talked about the flow, the timing of the stimuli on the screen. We controlled it through wait seconds. We used wait seconds, so the machine's timer essentially, to determine when it's time to present a new stimulus. We used the keyboard wait function instead to actually request for a button press at the end of each trial. And we repeated trials by using a for loop. Okay, we can also use a while loop. I'm not going to explain it right now. I'm going to be explaining it in a little while because it will become useful when we're dealing with actually recording responses. For the moment, we used a for loop, but you'll see that there's this other option, the while loop, which provides you some extra flexibility. Okay, all these things, however, are already covered inside the flow test script. So if you open the flow test script, you're going to be able to, I already have it open over here, all these things are going to be summarized, you know, with a little bit more text accompanying them. Okay, so if you're ever having any crashes or experiencing any problems, obviously go back to these scripts over here and try to see if you can work out what the main difference is between this script and yours. And that's it for this one, for this lesson over here. Next time we're going to be talking about response collection. So see you in a bit.